Thank you for inviting me. It's actually, I give this presentation quite a lot. It's actually nice to give it to people in my own district and neighbors, and it's really nice to have logged on early and seen so many familiar faces and good friends. So I just want to say hello and welcome, and I hope that everyone is doing well and is safe and healthy during the pandemic. So as one of the honors and privileges of being a state representative is you get to file legislation. And I filed the 2050 roadmap to a clean and thriving future because it is very apparent to me that we need a plan to achieve our greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. We are coastal communities. We see the impacts of climate change and sea level rise throughout the year in our day-to-day lives. And these issues always present as public safety, public health, environmental changes. But in fact, the solution is an economic one, and it's the decarbonization of our economy. And so I filed the 2050 roadmap, which is House 3983, because it updates the Global Warming Solutions Act to at least a net zero carbon emission reduction goal by 2050. It creates a comprehensive plan to achieve our climate goal. It creates a new accountability for implementation of effective and fair emission reduction standards. And it gives EEA, which is the Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, additional tools and resources to actually address the climate crisis. So what I thought I'd do today is to set a little of the context and to walk you through the bill so you know what we're up to. So the Global Warming Solutions Act was passed in 2008. And this is Chapter 21N. It is the law that's been on the books for 12 years. This is when we made the commitment to reduce our carbon emissions. This was I think this is the thing everyone always forgets, is that we have already committed to reducing our carbon emissions. The initial goal was statewide, 80% of the 1990 greenhouse gas emission levels by 2050. And the GWSA created this framework that EEA and the agencies would coordinate efforts to achieve the goals. And in fact, the GWSA in the intervening 10 years has undertaken numerous initiatives, a lot of which people on this call are very familiar with. Clean energy standards, the RGGI initiatives, the regional greenhouse gas initiatives, the renewable portfolio standards, procurement of wind and hydroelectric, development of net metering, and all of the solar initiatives, which a lot of people in Hingham have taken advantage of, electric vehicles, and the list goes on. And it's also been in other sectors too. I mean, you've seen some stretch codes, green communities like Hingham, and a lot of resilience work. That was the Environmental Bond Bill in 2018, and hopefully the Speaker's Green Works Bill. All of these initiatives and the GWSA made Massachusetts a leader in clean energy. And in fact, it's worked. If you take a look, but this slide is kind of busy, but what it's really showing us is that through the GWSA implementation, we've actually achieved a tremendous amount. We've already reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 20 million metric tons. And in fact, based on the reported numbers from 2017, it's looking pretty good and very likely that we will in fact make our 2020 carbon emission reduction goals. And sort of there's been a lot of articles out there about COVID and the pandemic and the fact that we all stopped driving because we all stopped commuting into work, and that's actually been a pretty one tiny positive thing that's happened recently. So we've had 10 years of experience with this bill, and it's really illuminated for us what works and what needs improvement and where some of the barriers are. So in fact, one of the big issues is that GWSA is very focused on energy, as I was just saying, greening the grid. But in fact, comprehensive strategies really need to be about more than just energy. And we need to be working in multiple sectors at the same time, and we need to have integrated strategies. And in fact, as you see, energy, we've actually done pretty well. We've got electricity is at 19%, but the transportation is really the lion's share of our carbon emissions right now at 43%. So I filed the 2050 roadmap. What it does is pretty straightforward, highly complicated sector, energy and what have you, but the bill itself is actually very straightforward. It resets the carbon emission reduction goal to net zero by 2050. It creates a plan that's intentional, thoughtful, and people-centric. It engages across all sectors, and it will include multiple pathways so that you don't have to just commit to one thing, to one way of getting there. It can be a more iterative process, and we can take advantage of new technologies. And then, of course, robust reporting, which will lead to much better accountability to both the public, which is the important thing, but also to the legislature. So first piece is, of course, the intentional planning. What I really mean by that is we start with the end goal. We start with the net zero carbon emissions in 2050. And then they will do a backcast analysis, which is just to say they're going to figure out what the schedule of emission reductions needs to be to achieve that goal. And then they're going to work their way forward with a plan, like any other strategy that we would do and any other planning aspects of our own local government. But the first step is to do that backcast analysis and to figure out the math and what the schedule of emission reductions needs to be. And the important piece is that the GWSA, as I said, really just focused on energy. We don't have time to just do this sequentially. We need to be engaging integrated strategies in multiple pathways across. So we're including energy, transportation, home efficiencies, conservation, land use plannings, all of those things. And the multiple pathways become very important because it will give us ways to really prioritize job creation and environmental justice issues, impacts on low-income communities. So just to expand a little bit further on the backcast, what I really am talking about is assessing the impacts on low-income and moderate-income environmental justice communities and planning to prioritize low-cost job creations, the equity issues, and really require that that data and that model be available to the public for scrutiny. Based on that backcast analysis, as I was explaining, we're going to develop the 2050 roadmap, and within that, we're going to update that plan every 30 months. That's very aggressive, but we can do this, and it gives us a much better ability to really take into account all of the new information that's gleaned over time, and hopefully to make it a more iterative process, which will just end up doing better for all of us, so that we don't just commit to one rigid idea that's too hard to shift away from. It'll always be part of the dialogue and the planning. And when I say intentional, what I really mean is to put people right at the center of it. The other important piece of this is environmental justice communities. Right now, we would be relying on a definition of an executive order out of the Patrick administration, and Governor Baker has continued to utilize that, but we really do need to codify that definition into law, and my colleague Michelle Dubois has a bill that's also in House Ways and Means. So it's actually, I just refer to the environmental justice by name, but we really do also need to be mindful to pull forward that bill as well, because it will make this much more robust. I guess the point here really is that we have an opportunity as we're planning, as we're investing in the green economy, as we're building out these plans, to lift everybody up. We should be doing things for the benefit of all people, not at the expense of people living in poverty. And it's a real opportunity, if we're thoughtful about it, to do that. As I mentioned before, the transparency and the accountability become critically important. We would have dropped strong 2030 and 2040 emission limits. Right now, that's a piece that's been missing. We would also require that to be a minimum threshold, a straight line, if you will. 50% by 2030, 75% by 2040, and so forth. But that's just a floor. it could be a much more aggressive, or it doesn't have to necessarily be a straight line, it could be a curved line. But the idea is that we need to be aggressive in this, and we need to have those plans in place so that we will actually have a framework for action. And then, of course, with the annual GWSA implementation progress reports will come that accountability piece to both the public and to the legislature. So I did also want to just mention, though, that I just sort of ran through right now what are the sort of four corners of the bill itself. But there are, in fact, a few other sections into the bill. And I just wanted to mention them to you because you all lobbied me on one of them, which is carbon pricing. The bill does call for market-based compliance mechanisms. In fact, that's already in the GWSA, but I think we should just use the word carbon pricing. Again, there are several bills out there that talk about a refund mechanism around the carbon pricing, but in fact, we already do carbon pricing. That is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is cap and trade. That's carbon pricing. So we already do it, and I just think we should use the words. This bill also calls for a fee on the top carbon emitters. I really feel strongly that we shouldn't create unfunded mandates, even for the state, and that if we're serious about this, we should track with some revenue. In fact, since the bill has been filed, the Baker administration has committed some revenues to there, and so there is actually dedicated line items to do some of this work. The other thing it calls for is to include municipal light plants in the GWSA. Right now they are exempt, which is interesting because in fact the state's only at about like 11 or 12% renewable emissions or renewable energy, whereas most of our munis are doing far better than we are, than the state is. But that is a piece that they have been exempt. So the bill purports to bring them all under the GWSA. And then Section 3D was responsive to a lawsuit by the Conservation Law Foundation, that was the New England Power Generators Association. And they lost that lawsuit, and they had argued that the GWSA was only for the 10 years and that it would sunset in 2020. And in fact, the SJC disagreed and said, no, it goes on. And now you can understand why some of the changes that we're proposing are things that we've learned over experience time, but also are things that we've learned from court analysis and interpretation. And so it's important to capture all of that in the bill to make it as up to date and robust as possible. So where this bill is right now is House Ways and Means. When we engaged upon this process, even before we had finished writing it, we shared this broadly with all of the key stakeholders. I mean, we went everywhere from the administration to the municipal light plants. I've visited with Hingham and Hull's light plants on multiple occasions, and everybody in between, labor, everyone. National Grid, Eversource. And in fact, we had a very robust dialogue with a lot of the stakeholders. And I think that was part of the reason why there started to really be some consensus around the bill. And we got a lot of great feedback, and it shaped how we drafted it. We got an early hearing, we got an early report out from the committee, and now we're in House Ways and Means. At the state of the Commonwealth, the governor committed from the podium to net zero as a target. Immediately following that ceremony, the speaker also committed in remarks to reporters to commit it to net zero as a target. And the Senate president has put forth several, what she refers to as the next generation climate change bills, again, committing to net zero. So we spent a lot of time, and there's a great amount of consensus around this bill. COVID hit, and now all legislation that is not COVID related is uncertain. We are coming to the end of the session, the formal session, which is July 31st, but the speaker has made remarks that he would like to see us do some additional legislative work, and to really, as he put it, that people had done so much great work, and there were a lot of really great bills out there, and he did want to pull some forward. But obviously our focus right now is appropriately on COVID and the response, and now the economic recovery piece. So we're hopeful that we will be able to persuade him to pull it forward this session. But if that's not to be, there's, like I said, a lot of consensus around this bill, a lot of action and activity. I should pause and give a little shout out to Elders Climate Action. Of all of we have many partners, many environmental partners on this one, but I have to say, they have just been the most tenacious and really wonderful to work with. They really understand, and they really get where we're at with our advocacy, and they've been a tremendous grassroots partner with their advocacy. They look to the future, they get the urgency, and their hard work really has helped advance this bill, and I think they understand that it helps advance the solutions for the long term. So I'm going to stop there. And I know that Laura was collecting some questions in the chat and was going to moderate a little discussion. So why don't I hold off and turn it back over to Laura. I do see that Anne Morin has asked, is there anything we can do at this point to help support the passage of this bill?
See, you're better at this than I am.
I spend my days on Zoom. I am actually pretty good at this.
You're so far ahead of it.
So yes, actually, in fact, even though as I'm looking through here, not everybody is in my district, and I think the first thing is that for any piece of legislation, having a good relationship with your legislator and having a dialogue and rapport is critically important. And so you should make sure to let your state rep and your state senator, because eventually this bill will go to the Senate, let them know that this topic is important to you and what's the pieces of policy that are important to you, and reference the bill so they can find it, and then guide them to me to ask how they can help navigate in the House itself or in the Senate. And don't forget to say thank you to them. Don't forget to make sure they know what it is that you're interested in, that what you think is important. And even if you think I know about it, it's still nice to send a note, because I'm just the face of it. It's really a grassroots effort. And so I do want to hear from people to say, I think your bill is spot on, or I think, I'm here to support you in any way I can. And then the other things you can do is, some of the grassroots organizations are advocating right now, and we're trying to be very sensitive. We don't want to be tone deaf to COVID pandemic. People have died. And we are trying to figure out the economic recovery piece and the budget, and a lot of bandwidth goes towards that. So we do have to be respectful, but I think people can say to their state reps, and we can say to the speaker that we're ready to do this when he is, that there is consensus around this bill, right? It might not be your top priority, and it might not be the first one you would call for it, but it's the one that's moving, and there's consensus around the need for this bill, and that we are ready to have a substantive, meaty conversation about something non-COVID. I think those are the messages that you can share with your state rep, with the senators, and that we would like to see something done this year. I will file this bill again next year if we can't manage it. Don't worry.
So Mike Bellali says, say this passes in the House and the Senate, but dies in conference. How will we know who supports the bill and who opposes it?
Why would it die in conference? I spent 18 months working and speaking to all of my colleagues in the House, but also to our friends in the Senate as well. And I think that, as I said, I think that there is consensus around this bill. I believe Senator Barrett made some remarks that he would very much like to see this bill come forward from the House. And if you read the next generation climate change bills, closely, you'll see that in fact, the senator has pulled forward all of the significant pieces, except for one part of this bill, into the next gen bills. So the Senate has already said that they embrace this topic. I know they want to do more. I would love to do more too, but I think you'll find that if we can get this to the floor of the House, that the Senate will be receptive, because if you look closely at that bill, it's all in there.
Okay, John Daly says, are there competing bills for the state to get to net zero?
So there are a number of bills that are still pending that contribute to how we get there. They don't really compete with this bill dead on, because what this bill is doing is updating the framework that's calling forth all of these pieces and will interconnect with them. The example I like to say is Sarah Peak from the Cape filed some bills that the Nature Conservancy supports around carbon sequestration. This is the kind of, my bill is updating the existing framework, and the work of this bill is going to call forward a need for those policies. The same thing with the environmental justice bill that I mentioned. It's not competing. My bill really only works if we can pull forward and codify a robust definition of environmental justice. Again, you know, on the carbon pricing, my bill authorizes carbon pricing, but there are two other bills that speak to how you would do a refund policy program and mechanism. So instead of cap and trade, it would be cap and invest. So a lot of these bills have a lot of interplay. And again, it's not better or worse. I'm updating an existing framework and calling for aggressive action. Think of all the beautiful electric vehicle bills that John Hecht filed. I mean, so there's really, the community solar. I mean, this is the framework that will pull that all forward.
John Dealey is also asking, have any climate advocacy groups supported this bill?
Oh,
and yeah. I can help with that, because I'm going to share my screen right now. Here is the packet, the legislative packet for this bill, showing the advocacy groups who support this bill.
Yeah.
So that's not all of them. That's just who happens to be on the piece of paper, but right. It pretty much covers the waterfront on that. Kristen says, is Massachusetts collaborating with other states to reach net zero by 2050?
So yes and no. So as a state representative for Massachusetts, I only have the ability to impact that which is within the ambit of my authority, right? So I can only put forward and vote on legislation for Massachusetts. But I would note two things. We are 50% of the power generation, the power demand in New England. And we already act regionally through ISO New England, which is the energy procurement for all of our power. So we already have these collaborative agreements in place to function as region. And oftentimes what happens is, because what we do is so heavily weighted in those relationships, we often have a greater impact than just within our borders. The other thing I will note too is, as I was talking before about the GWSA, that was really landmark legislation. And if you take a survey of the 50 states, you'll see that a lot of states are now, and have subsequently and continue to bring forward their versions of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And they've taken our legislation and made it better. They let us work out the bugs almost, if you will, and all the kinks, and then they bring it forward themselves. And people watch Massachusetts, they look to see what we do, and they bring it forward too. So we have both a regional impact and a leadership role to play here as well.
Ben Hillman asks, what's the enforcement mechanism for reaching the goals in the bill?
So enforcement in what manner? In terms of
Well,
So,
what if the state falls short? What could be done? I guess.
so yes,
I think I've got the sense of the question.
I was okay. So, in fact, it's a commitment. It's a shared commitment we've made. And the reason we need this bill is so that there is a planning and a mechanism to actually take action around it. But that's the whole point around the robust reporting, is so that the public and the legislature will know how we're doing relative to our goals, to our carbon emission goals, and to be able to track it much more closely so that we can actually call for action and we can push whichever administration. State reps come and go, governors come and go. That's why this bill is so important, because it puts in place the policy framework for actual planning and action. Because we're planning not just for the next few years, we're planning for the next 30 years. And that's the piece, that's the commitment piece that's made. That being said, the other piece, that was part of how we got the administration going in the first place, was responsive to Conservation Law Foundation lawsuits. So it's really
right, because it
Mhm.
had they went to court because the state was not meeting its requirements under the
Right.
Global Warming Solutions Act, and the
Yeah.
Supreme Judicial Court said you have
Mhm.
to do this.
Right.
So that
So
still stands.
that still stands, and that's why we need those requirements, because that's how external groups will hold us accountable for these kinds of things. But quite frankly, it has to be a statewide commitment, and we do this together or we don't do it at all.
And Morin says, what are your thoughts on how we can transform transportation? Are you confident that the state will want to invest heavily in public transportation upgrades?
Yes. So in fact, before the pandemic, the House of Representatives had put forward a bond bill to start to take up exactly these issues. And MassDOT and the MBTA have been doing really robust visioning, as opposed to, say, actual planning. And they are taking into consideration all of these pieces. But this is why this bill is important, because then it's up to the Secretary of Environmental Affairs, Energy and Environmental Affairs, to actually connect and coordinate and integrate all of these plans. And there's in fact an office of climate policy that's responsible for doing these things. So we've really put into place, and there's an advisory board, I'm sure everyone on here knows, there's an advisory board as well that could be improved. We'll get to that next session. But these are all the pieces for us to push them to do that. And the MBTA and MassDOT have started to take those steps, and I think it's going to be up to us to really call for it. The governor has put forward his transportation climate initiative. That actually predates the Baker administration, and they have stated publicly that this is one of their top priorities. So I really feel like what we're really trying to do is align all of these groups, align all of these initiatives towards that one goal, so that everybody can contribute their piece.
So Clark Frazier says, in addition to carbon pricing, is there any authorization for pricing less efficient activities more and using the proceeds to support more efficient activities like telecommuting and transit?
Not yet, but we'll have some more. There is a lot more work to be done, Clark. You're visionary.
Yeah, he also says, is there a component for identifying capital intensive or long lead time precursor activities?
Ooh, very interesting question. Not that I'm aware of, but again, these are the kinds of, when you're really doing that comprehensive integrated planning across the sectors, these are the kinds of things that we really need to be thinking about and how we do them. When is the last internal combustion engine going to be permitted or licensed in Massachusetts, right? I mean, those are questions we have to figure out. And it's both it's very heady stuff. It's both supply chain, it's both, how do they get repaired? Is the infrastructure there for electric vehicles? I mean, these are all the important pieces that have to be pushed forward. And I think one of the hardest ones that's going to be really a challenge to get at is going to be housing. We obviously in Third Plymouth, this is an old district. We have old towns and we have a lot of old houses. And how do you get at those pieces as well? So I think it's both an infrastructure piece as well as an incentive piece, because when you start to get into just regular people's lives, it's easy to do energy, right? We just say this is how we're going to procure. This is the goal for the renewable portfolio standards. We're going to start investing in here. But when you start to get into the day-to-day lives of how you commute, it's much more complicated. And that's why we need the comprehensive plan to bring all of that piece forth. So I think it's actually very exciting. And I really feel like if we do this right, this bill will, well, the Global Warming Solutions Act's there, but if we do the right updates to it right now, these are critical updates, it's going to be transformative.
Arnie Epstein asks if might there be a partial budget passed soon that provides an opportunity for the roadmap bill to move forward this summer?
So they would not put a bill like this into a budget item. It will either come forward itself or it won't. But yes, you will see we're voting on a 1/12 budget tomorrow. And we hear tell of a partial budget to follow after that. Part of the challenge is figuring out what the metrics are for predicting revenues for the state. It's a little bit easier on the local level because, of course, we have our property taxes and we know what that property tax base is. For the state, the receipts are a little bit harder because it's things like sales tax, right, and payroll taxes and things like that. So they're trying to be very cautious and conservative and to make sure that as we're making commitments in the budget, that they're commitments that people can rely on. The one thing I think nobody wants to do is rush to judgment about and just put something out for the sake of having it out and then having to deal with the commensurate 9C cuts down the road. I think we want people to really have this true commitment. The other piece that everyone's waiting for is to see what the federal government will do through the HEROES Act, and where if some of you, many of you were around in 2008 when we had the economic downturn then, and 2001 as well, and what you saw was the federal government, taking those initial steps here, at least around the pandemic, to make sure we had what we needed, but now it will be about the recovery and what investments they're going to make. So it's hard to know what will come. The House seems willing to put things out, but the Senate has been holding that up. So we're hopeful that that dialogue will continue, and we have a fantastic delegation. We have wonderful senators, Warren and Markey, who are in there advocating for us every step of the way, and we're very fortunate that Congressman Neal is chairing the Ways and Means. So Massachusetts is well positioned to advocate, and we're just trying to feel our way. So, yeah.
Okay, so Clark's got a couple more questions. I'm going to ask John Dealey's first because we've already had two from Clark, and then I'll get back to that. Assume the bill is approved and the policy people come up with plans to reach net zero. Does that plan come forward as a bill for approval, as one bill, or multiple bills? No, in fact, the administration has started to move forward with some of this. So we know this has been a long time dialogue with the administration throughout the sort of history of this bill. And in fact, it was our advocacy that resulted in the governor committing to net zero. The reason this was important was because they were already procuring the backcast analysis to initiate that planning. And for those of you who are energy and wonks, I'm sure you've been following the process. They have been even though the COVID pandemic was well underway, they continued their process for public comments. And what does net zero mean, and how much should we be relying on things like carbon sequestration? And so that process has continued, and that's actually part of the urgency of doing this bill right now, is that we don't want the administration to go too far down the path without having the policy framework firmly in place. We've been very fortunate that the commissioner who runs the climate office actually is sort of a man on the inside, if you will, is a friend to us, and he has been advocating for things like multiple pathways and for different frameworks, if you will, to figure that out. So that's part of the thing, is that it's actually happening now.
We are glad that they have continued to move forward. That funding is in place for them, and we don't want to lose it, and we do want to continue that work. But that's part of the reason why we want to make sure that this bill gets passed, so that they do it in that way, that the robust reporting way that we talked about earlier.
So somewhat apropos of that, Alan Fierce asks, would it help if we advocated for an extension of the legislative session past July 31st to allow for important bills like this to have a better chance? August 31st, September 30th?
You know, I feel like if it's going to come forward, it's going to come forward within July. Once we get past that, I think you're going to find is that everyone is really focused on the budget. And so what I've been trying to do is to advocate to have us fall into sort of that sweet spot before we really take up the budget. Because I feel like once we get past that July 31st deadline, they've talked about extending it. You certainly welcome to advocate for it to continue. But I feel like that is less certain. But we will see us continue to do budget work throughout as that continues to shape. And I think the further it goes down, the more likely that we're going to be focused on other components of it. For those of you who follow State House News, they just announced that the House is forming a panel, a review Green Committee energy priorities. And what they're going to basically be doing is reviewing existing policy proposals, any new ideas, and they're going to look at it in the light of the sort of the new normal of the pandemic. And I think really what it's going to be focused on is economic impacts to the green industry and really figuring out what the pathways are to a cleaner, more resilient Commonwealth. So I think we will see this work continue, but my guess is that we won't see the legislative session necessarily continue. So, but it's just 6 months to being sworn in and filing new legislation, and we have done a tremendous amount of work to build consensus, to educate. I met with 100, and with Laura's help actually, 110 offices, 110 state representatives heard about this bill. So, you know, when I really think about, we went to every sector, we talked to every stakeholder, and if you really look back on the slide that Laura showed you about the really diverse number of advocacy organizations who said that this bill is a priority and that there's great consensus around this bill. It might not have been their top priority, and it doesn't mean they're not advocating for other bills. It's just that this was one that had great consensus. And I would hope that we would be able to persuade the leadership to pull this bill forward early in the session, if it doesn't happen to make it through this time around. But I'm still working it. I am still working for it.
Ann Moran asks, is it worthwhile for towns and cities to declare a commitment to net zero and develop their own policies and plans?
Yes, it is very exciting for me to hear towns declare their own commitment to net zero. I actually think this is one of the best things that you can do. A lot of grassroots advocacy often results in state level action. That's one of the big things they're looking for is are there commitments by towns? They're very concerned about what the impacts on towns are, but you've seen the speaker put forward his GreenWorks bill. That bill is almost the commensurate sort of funding bill, if you will, to the 2050 roadmap bill. Mine's the framework policy of how you would spend that money and the priorities that you would spend that money on. And then that GreenWorks bill was the investments in the local level for the big infrastructure pieces. It's very exciting stuff. So to have the Hingham actually commit to net zero and to be starting to figure out strategies, you're going to be then calling for grants, and you're going to put forward projects through things like the Green Communities Act. You're going to be initiating a lot of things that this funding will be there for. And I really feel like it's almost a chicken and the egg kind of a situation where if you're calling for it, we'll be responsive to it and it'll be all right here. So I actually think that your commitment to net zero in some ways is much more foundational and formative, and will actually spur the call to action on the state level. So I'm very excited about your plans and about your commitments.
Okay, back to Clark. Since the Old Colony is the only commuter rail corridor within 128th that's not double track, is there any mechanism to identify major public transit bottlenecks?
So in fact, we have I think it's MassDOT that looks at it. Maybe CTPS might be the agency. I forget all the alphabet soups. But in fact, the MBTA has looked at this rail corridor to look for the choke points and the double track. It's the reason why we don't have the robust schedule on the commuter rail that we would really like to have. And what ends up happening is we compete with the Kingston line, and when they build the South Coast line, in fact, we'll end up competing with two other commuter rails. So what they've done is they have mapped out not only where the choke points are, the single tracks, but they have also mapped out where the rights of way and the land ownerships are. And we are going to be actively working with the House Chair of Transportation, Bill Strauss, who is a big proponent of the South Coast Rail. And this is an important project to him as well. And so we have started, and I'm hoping that Clark is going to help me as my behind the scenes advisor on transportation issues and help me articulate how we can best advocate for those projects, because that's really what's going to open up and make the commuter rail so much more, much more effective for us.
Clark also asks, can we ask the utilities to upfront fund wiring residential parking lots and condos and apartments for electric cars with the expectation of recovering the cost through user fees?
Well, they would recover their cost through rates. That's how they recover their costs. So be careful what you wish for. It's just the way it works. Yeah.
Clayton Handelman says there's super low cost wind power in the Great Plains. My understanding is that states like Massachusetts are reluctant to purchase wind power from the Great Plains. Is there thinking about how to get people to support creating markets for Great Plains wind power here? If we were to state that we were opening our market to them, it would add pressure to approve a high voltage DC power line right away to bring that power to us.
So I think the priority right now has been offshore wind. And the way people talk about it when I was coming into the State House was that this was one of our great untapped resources, right? We don't necessarily have sun, right? So we're never going to have sort of the same robust solar that, say, Texas would have, although we have got solar and we do have sun to that some extent. But our big untapped resource is really turned out to be wind. And what they're saying, and some of the presentations I've been hearing, has been that wind really, there's a tremendous sort of a net positive that we would actually be exporting energy around wind. One of the debates has also been is when you procure external, like we're going to do, say, for hydroelectric, we do get the benefit of those green electrons, those carbon-free electrons, right? But we don't necessarily glean the benefit of them here in Massachusetts. And I think there's a lot of jobs that come with that. There's industry, the whole sector. There's the health benefits of using, powering our plants in that way. So I think across the board, what they're really trying to do is make those investments here to the extent that we can. If you think about the geography of it, we are at the end of all energy systems, right? We're at the end of the gas pipelines, we're at the end, like everything, because we're so distant from all of the other energy sources. And I think that's one of the big reasons why they're so keen on making those investments here in Massachusetts itself.
So Clayton, of course, has an answer. He says offshore wind is good, but it blows at a different time of day. So in a 2050 timeline, you'll need more than just the offshore wind.
That's right. You will absolutely. And that's one of the big reasons why the plan is so important, because it has to be integrated. So just using that as an example, if you really want your renewable energy, that means that we have to make investments in storage, energy storage, and battery technology. And those are the kinds of discussions that will come forth from this kind of a planning effort, because it will say, what do we need to do to avail ourselves of this wind resource? What will we need to do to offset it? And there's been some really cool dialogues around things like, the fact that if we all have electric cars, those cars operate, not only do they charge from our houses, but they also can operate as batteries for our houses. So there's so much cool technology coming around, and that's the point of this bill, is to make sure that those dialogues are happening commensurate with they're not just conversations, they're not just plans that we get dusty on a shelf. It's about actually doing the math and saying, all right, this is what the schedule of emission reductions are. How are we going to get those emission reductions? How are we going to meet that schedule? That's the whole point. And if you have multiple pathways, you can take a chance and go down a pathway around things like energy storage, and see how it works, but because you're working on multiple fronts. So it's a very exciting time. And some of the presentations, if you've ever gone to the Greentown Labs, they have us, they always have legislators come through for these kinds of things, and it's like science fiction. So it's a really interesting science, and think about all the brain power we have here, universities and everything. So
I'm gonna wrap BJ Burke's question in with Alan Fierce's. BJ says, what difficulties do you foresee if the roadmap reaches a conference committee with the Senate? And Alan says, the Senate's next gen bill has passed the Senate and is now also in House Ways and Means. Does it make any strategic sense for the House to pass the roadmap bill along with some select provisions of the next gen bill to make that package more attractive to the Senate in a conference committee?
So in theory, yes, that is above my pay grade. So it's hard to know what they're thinking about. I will say that when we drafted the roadmap bill, we could have included a lot of things in here. Energy policy is complicated stuff. I mean, we've all sort of immersed ourselves in it, and so we're conversant and fluent in the language of it, and we get how it works. But I can just tell you that when the Senate bill came over, a lot of my colleagues looked at that and they thought, oh, I don't even know how to start thinking about this. And so one of the big strategies here that we employed was going door to door, because then I could sit with every colleague and I could sit with all of the staff members and walk them through it. And we really spent the time socializing this bill in the House of Representatives. So I think it's much more likely what will happen is that my colleagues and peers will feel comfortable moving this forward and sending it over to the Senate. Whether they include a few other things or not is hard to say, but I don't think at this time that it's realistic to have a global omnibus bill. And as you suggest, they could pull forward a few things that are important so that the Senate would have their wins, right? We have our priorities, they have their priorities, and everybody needs to have a win. So I think that is something that is likely could happen, because everything's a compromise and you do have to find a way to get to yes. But I do know that they are comfortable with the provisions of my bill, because a lot of it's already in the next gen. So, in fact, the one thing that didn't make it in was the environmental justice piece. And I know that's an ongoing dialogue with Chairman Barrett. It's just not a piece that he prioritizes and really feels is a key mechanism, and I respect that. But that, so there'll definitely be some discussion along those lines, but the chairman has said that he's very receptive to passing the 2050 roadmap. So he made those remarks last week at an MAPC presentation, a legislative breakfast. So yeah, which was exciting to hear. So.
And Warren asked, do you think Massachusetts residents have a good understanding of the climate crisis and the sense of urgency, generally speaking?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that's a better question for all of you. I would say here in our district, Scituate, Hingham, Hull, Cohasset, yes, absolutely. When as you've all heard me speak in the past, I file legislation and I take up topics with the lens is the district, right? There's so many amazing issues that I could be working on right now, but the district is my lens. And this was the #1 topic that I heard people talk about. And this is one of the things that inspired me to run. And this is one of the most important, I think it's the most impactful thing that's in our district right now. So I don't know what they think. I don't know what they think of the Berkshires.
I think that we've come to the end of the questions here, and we've just about come to the end of the hour. So I would just like to really thank you for laying this all out for people. And I'd like to thank everybody for taking time out of your evening to learn about this. And if you would like to know more about Joan, you can go to joanmeschino.com, or more about Hingham Net Zero. You can go to hinghamnetzero.org, and we would love to be in touch with you in the future. So thanks very much, and good night.
Good night, everyone. Be well.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.